So that's Montesquieu's problem, how you escape from Inquisition and absolutism. The problem behind today's thinker, Adam Smith, is not dissimilar. He's often thought of as the founder of modern economics, which he is, of course, but he's also a political thinker, a moralist. His first great book, Theory of Moral Sentiments, in 1759, which is on the handout noted there, is about moral philosophy. There's something odd about Adam Smith which you may not know, which is that almost no one really understood what he was writing about until very recently. You may have thought, well, he wrote in the 18th century. He was born, as you see, in Kirkcaldy in 1723. Surely we'd have known everything he had to say quite a long time ago. But in fact, his notebooks, and particularly his lectures, were only rediscovered in a second-hand bookshop in Glasgow in the 1970s, and then edited up in the 1980s. So almost half of his writings were only discovered 20 years ago. And like Montesquieu, you have to take the whole corpus of his writings to understand what he was about, because he wasn't just an economist. The Wealth of Nations, his famous book of 1776, is only a tiny part of his work. His essays, his philosophical work is important too. So what I'm going to do very briefly is to tell you about him as a person, then why I think he was such a great thinker, both what the events that shaped his life and the theoretical methodology, and then leave myself some time for his conclusions, which is what would interest you most. Incidentally, how many of you have ever read any Adam Smith? Anyone read any? Again, using the, if you were asked in the bar to name the theory of Adam Smith test, how many of you could name a theory of his? Those of you who did SPS, did you learn anything about Adam Smith? Yes? No? No? Yes or no? No. Well, you've all heard of Adam Smith, but otherwise your minds are in a Lockean sense, a tabula rasa, an empty palette on which I can draw now. Well, that's a great pleasure and privilege. So I'll tell you about one of the greatest thinkers of all time. Adam Smith was born in Kirkcaldy in 1723, and he went to this little school, a humbler school than most of you probably ever went to, the Kirkcaldy School, which was used as a store and now has been pulled down, so it's no longer there. He then went on to Glasgow University. In those days, they used to go to university very young, so he went at about 14 or 15. He was a very good mathematician. And Glasgow at this time was one of the central, it was the Beijing, so to speak, or the Shanghai of the 18th century. It was growing very, very fast. And within these walls, many of the greatest thinkers who've ever lived were wandering around. Down the passage, for example, from him was James Watt, the discoverer of the separate condenser and the steam engine. James Black, the great chemist, and other philosophers of great eminence and note were there. He then went on to Oxford later, spent 7 miserable or 10 miserable years in Oxford, had several mental breakdowns probably as a student. He's just terribly depressed. He found it a lazy, useless place, as many others did at that time. But he did admire the British civilization he saw, or the English civilization, the wealth and affluence of it. Then he came back to Scotland. He lived in this house in Kirkcaldy for a long time. The house looks rather prepossessing in that Scottish lowland style, but behind it had a lovely garden which he used to walk around. And he spent a lot of time there thinking and reading. This is the chair he sat and thought in. And that's the table where he kept his books. He walked up and down this room and lectured. His handwriting, as you'll see in a minute, was terrible, so he he couldn't really write his lectures or his various publications, so he dictated them. And this is why it has given rise to a joke that if you look at the sentences in the Wealth of Nations, they're all much the same length. And the argument here is that he would walk up and down. I won't, because poor Xiao Xiao is trying to film me. But he would walk up and down, and when he got to and turned round, the scribe would put a full stop, and then he'd walk back again. So the sentences were roughly the same length. Anyway, he sat in this chair, and he had a very good library, which is part of which is in King's College in the Keynes collection, part of it in Japan. And he kept his manuscripts in this desk. One of the reasons we knew so little about him was that he wrote a letter to David Hume and asked him to burn all his unpublished manuscripts when he died. No one quite knows why. So much of his writings were lost. Almost all he wrote was in this chest, and the contents mainly were burnt, though luckily the executors thought that they'd better save some of it against his will. He wrote The Wealth of Nations and other things, as I say, by dictation. And the scribe, you see the main handwriting, but there are just a few words in the margin there of his own. It's not too bad, the handwriting, but he found it very difficult. He couldn't do joined-up handwriting without great difficulty. His speech had an impediment too, so he stammered. And there's just a tiny bit of his handwriting, just to show you. O-P-U in that opulence is his handwriting, and the rest of it is the scribe. He gave up after 3 letters there. This is just to encourage you all. What was he like? Well, again, he's too early really for a good portrait, so he's rather like Montesquieu, turned into a kind of Roman senator like that. I think he was probably quite a good-looking man, but it wasn't quite like that, I don't suppose. So this is the man who has changed our world as a philosopher. He changed the world because his ideas, rather like Montesquieu, without Montesquieu the French and American revolutions would not have occurred in the way they did. Without Adam Smith, the British Empire would not have been as it was. Many of the greatest prime ministers, for instance, I found on a postcard in King's Library, on the back of it a great historian had summarised his life. A Scot by birth and descent, and mixing with the skippers and merchants of Glasgow, where he was long a professor, he caught the temper of a great seaport struggling against fiscal fetters. His Wealth of Nations, the Bible of economic science, states in powerful and measured terms the case for freedom of trade, and has long governed British policy. Pitt the younger, Huskisson, Peel, Gladstone, Asquith were his pupils, the soul of modesty. So the British Empire is really based on the philosophy of Adam Smith, as is later economics and much social science. The other formative influences is that he lived as a recluse much of his life, but he also went out in certain bursts. He travelled in France and met all the great French philosophers in 1764 to 6. He was lionised, he went round all the clubs. And later he lived in London for the last 2 years of writing The Wealth of Nations. Now, the reason he was able to do so many amazing things is partly the times. I've listed them here. I think I don't want to spend the rest of the lecture. I'll just summarise. Basically, the West Indies and trade into Glasgow made Glasgow a very rich and different world. The growth of America was beginning to puzzle and interest him. This is all expanded if you're interested in the riddle of the modern world. The apparent stasis, I'll come back to that, that is the static state of Japan, China and India, also puzzled him. In the middle of his life, the Highland Scots were defeated at Culloden in 1745, and he saw the end of a certain kind of civilization on his doorstep, and also the decline of Calvinism. His mother was a very strict Calvinist, but he was probably an atheist or an agnostic. He saw the growth of science, and the influence of Newton and others on him was very considerable. He travelled into England, and he saw the great contrast between France, England and Scotland. England as much more affluent now in the middle of the 18th century, and the beginnings of the change from predation to production. Glasgow was a building site behind his study. Every day new buildings would be going up. It was roaring ahead. On a small scale, it's what you see, as I say, in Beijing or Shanghai now. And he saw the move from a pastoral to a commercial economy occurring in southern Scotland and the beginnings of a manufacturing revolution. And he was part of the development of philosophy, especially through the work of David Hume, his closest friend, academic friend, and the French philosophe. Now, in order to understand what was happening around him, he developed a theoretical methodology which took bits of what Montesquieu had used, but took them further. And I'll very briefly again summarize these for you, because most of the methods now used by sociologists, anthropologists, economists, and any other social scientists were already invented in the 18th century by Montesquieu and Adam Smith, and later by Tocqueville. Firstly, the whole framework for the anthropology tripos and the way we understand the world, although of course we always argue with it and reject it, which is that there are 4 stages of human societies: hunters and gatherers, pastoralists, settled cultivators, and commercial societies, because industrialism hadn't started with him. That was partly invented by Montesquieu and then elaborated and given firmity by Adam Smith and his friends, particularly Adam Smith. So, and these were determined by the modes of subsistence. The way you earned a living, extracted surpluses from nature, determined the stages of human development, and there were 4 of them, and you moved from one to the next. So a stadial, as it's known, a stages theory of history, comes in with the middle of the Enlightenment in the 18th century. And of course we have objections to this, but anthropologists still write books called Tribesmen, Peasants, and so on. A second method, which his philosophy of human nature is among the greatest there is. I ought to mention that he was known as the most erudite, thoughtful, widely read man since Aristotle. He thought very deeply. He was a very good mathematician, a very good classicist. His library was very rich. He was a really deep thinker on every aspect, including human nature. And his view of human nature is that we are caught in a contradiction between 2 drives: self-love, selfishness, acquisitiveness, games playing, aggression. All those sides of us are part of human nature. And virtue, or the desire, as he mainly put it, to be loved by others. Self-love and social love is what he called them in the theory of moral settlements. And our civilizations and our lives come out of that clash. I'm currently in the privileged position of watching my grandchildren who've come back from Australia growing up, and they're 5 and 3. So every day I watch this balance. Sometimes they're pushing themselves, sometimes they're trying to earn the love of their grandfather, etc. And you see this tension going on all the time. And this was the central tension behind the development of human societies, he thought. The invisible hand may be one of the theories you've heard about. Basically what I think happened was that it was a bit like, I often think, like the Cheshire Cat in Alice in Wonderland. Up till Adam Smith's time, what had controlled the world in Western philosophy was God. God had written the laws of nature early on, and they controlled this world. What Adam Smith did was, in a sense, abolish God, push him to one side, but maintain the idea that there is an invisible hand, something regulating the market, in particular the economic market, laws of supply and demand, but many other things as well. So the external world was still ruled by rules and laws, but it wasn't ruled by an intervening God. The next bit of methodology was a development of something I mentioned with Montesquieu, which is the Newtonian method of induction and deduction. He wrote a lot about theory, and he was very knowledgeable, and he went to mathematics lectures and lectures on Newton. And basically he did what I mentioned Montesquieu did, and we all have to do. You start with what was known as analysis. You start with the facts. If If you don't start with the facts, however constituted, your theory is going to be wishy-washy and will bear no resemblance to the world as it is. So you start with facts of some kind or other. You then, from that, you induce more general laws. But once you've got those laws, you then go back and check the facts against them and look for other facts. So you move back and forth all the time in your inquiry between the two. If you veer too far towards just fact grubbing, it's no good. If you just wander around in hypotheses, or synthesis as it's called, then you get nowhere. It's the tension between these two methods that is essential in all social inquiry. The law of unintended consequences is quite similar to the invisible hand. It's basically that all of us do things for one reason, but the consequences of that action are not what we intend at all. And this is why, although we all may be selfish and so on, in the famous parable of the bees by Mandeville, Mandeville, he argued that private vice, we all seek our own ends and gains and so on, ends up unintentionally in public virtue, in people on the whole living socially together. This is an unintended consequence of our actions, and that has enormous effect in history. The theory of paradigms and theory of creativity. I mentioned that Thomas Kuhn was famously associated with the theory of paradigm shifts at the beginning. But in fact, Adam Smith had anticipated this completely in the middle of the 18th century. He wrote a famous essay, which is in his philosophical essays, if you're interested, on the history of astronomy. And what he basically did there was he said, look, the Greeks had an astronomical system which they thought was true, Ptolemy and the rest of them. The medievals destroyed this and replaced it with another paradigm. Newton has replaced it with another paradigm, and one day someone will replace Newton's paradigm with another one. So worldviews shift. There is no end to science. It's an open discipline. Now this is just Kuhn. This is what Kuhn says. And although Adam Smith doesn't go into the social roots or causes of this, he's already anticipated the relativity of theoretical systems beautifully in a short essay there. He goes into how things are caused, the chains of causation, the direct and indirect causes of things in the same way as Montesquieu. And of course he's deeply aware of the need for comparison and the comparative method. He draws on all that was known about the world, China, Japan, India, American Indians, in the same way as Montesquieu. And he develops, as Montesquieu did, the idea of analytical models, of simplified versions of reality. But he also develops something which is known as conjectural history. Conjecture has often a bad association in anthropology because Malinowski attacked what he called conjectural history. He said functionalism must be based on studying the present situation. It's no good all this diffusionist nonsense and evolutionary nonsense where they conjectured the possible stages of human societies and so on. He didn't really understand what conjectural history was, because he hadn't read, as far as I know, Adam Smith and the rest of them. Adam Smith's theory of conjectural history, which is analysed by his successor and great biographer, Dugald Stewart, S-T-E-W-A-R-T, was the self-evident fact that if you're trying to deal with very complex subjects, and particularly subjects on which the information is rather scarce, like the past, you have to make guesses. What you do is you guess, you make a conjecture, you test it against the evidence. Does it work? Is it efficient? Does it elicit new facts and so on? Then you reject it. In other words, you have to have hypotheses. That's all he's saying. And finally, the theoretical methodology, which is linked to the idea of the invisible hand and the law of unintended consequences. He basically said, and this is very much taken from Newton, basically the world is a machine. This is, as I mentioned, rather like functionalism. A bicycle is a machine, social structures are machines, but for him everything was a machine. And the task of the social scientist was to try and determine how these machines worked. So you have interlocking functional parts, philosophical systems, economic systems, social systems, and our task is to try and understand the laws of motion which connect all these different parts. Now, if you believe that, as he did believe it, then it gives you the possibility of doing serious analysis. If you believe it's all chaos and random and there's no connections and there is no machine out there, the machine of the universe, then it's very difficult to do the kind of analysis that he and many others did. Now, that's, in a nutshell, his theory and methodology, or at least his methodology. I now want to turn to his findings. I'll make a start and then... right. These are just a few of his theories. He wrote... Wealth of Nations is a very long book, and his lectures on jurisprudence, which are his stuff on political economy and so on, is very long. So it's quite a large corpus, and he has many ideas, and I can only summarize some of them. The first is very important to grasp, which is that he basically believed that, all else being equal, human societies would develop towards wealth. The secret was to try and take away the inhibitions or traps that stop us from becoming wealthy civilizations and societies. There is a natural tendency, a spring, so to speak, through history towards progress, and particularly towards economic progress. He gave a lecture when he was very young to an undergraduate society in Edinburgh in about 1751, in which he made this famous statement, which summarizes a lot of Adam Smith, and it keeps coming back into my mind. So I'll read it slowly twice. Little else is requisite to carry a state to the highest degree of opulence from the lowest barbarism. That doesn't really matter if you don't copy that bit down. To get to opulence from barbarism, what do you need? Peace, easy taxes, and a tolerable administration of justice. All the rest being brought about by the natural course of things. All you need is peace, easy, and that's not low taxes, but easy taxes, as I'll explain, and a tolerable administration of justice. What's interesting there is that what you need for economic development is political stability, is what he's saying. And as I will point out, I hope later, he's not saying it is easy to achieve these things. It's interesting giving this talk on the eve of a possible another world war, which many of you are concerned about, because the avoidance of war on a serious level is not at all easy, nor is it easy, as we'll see, to be reasonable in your taxation system or to provide a proper judicial system. Very few societies have managed to achieve these three things. But he says if you do, then you will have wealth. This is because human beings naturally want to make money. Not exactly make money, but in the famous phrase at the beginning of the Wealth of Nations, he says that what leads to the division of labour and the accumulation of wealth is, quote, a certain propensity in human nature to truck, barter and exchange one thing for another. Now, many people oversimplify this and say, you know, he's a simple-minded formalist who believes we're all out just to make money, and any anthropologist can show that that isn't the case. We often pursue other things than the profit in that sense. But he's not as simple-minded as that. But he says that we are basically competitive games-playing individuals who want to maximize something in relation. This is a distinctive feature of mankind, to develop, connected to the development of reason and speech, he thinks. He wrote a famous essay on the development of languages, by the way. It is common to all men and to be found in no other race of animals which seem to know neither this nor any other species of contracts. He says that what we really love is to try and persuade other people to do what we want them to do. And he has a rather interesting example. He says when you pay someone some money, you may think you're just buying something, but basically you're trying to persuade them to part with what they've got to give it to you. The offering of a shilling, which to us appears to have so plain and simple a meaning, is in reality offering an argument to persuade one to do so, and so as it is for his interest. Men always endeavour to persuade others to be of their opinion, even when the matter has no consequence to them. Take these lectures. I love giving them, and I'm always trying to persuade you to think in the way that I want you to think. I mean, I could just read out something and put all my effort elsewhere, but I really want you to be persuaded, to be interested in Adam Smith or whatever I'm talking about. And many of you know just the joy of arguing and persuading people. That's the natural progress of affluence, if constraints are lifted. I'll come back to the constraints later. The theory of the division of labour, which will be the last bit I talk about before I break. This again may be something which you, if you hadn't been so modest, would say, well, yes, I've heard that Adam Smith developed the theory of the division of labour and its advantages. This is one of his most famous theories. It wasn't invented by him. The Greeks had the idea. It was in Mandeville, the Fable of the Bees, who actually invented the term the division of labour. But it was Adam Smith who made it the engine, just as Marx, as I'll talk later, uses the dialectic as the engine of social change. So Adam Smith uses the division of labour. What has made societies wealthy is the principle of the division of labour. Well, what does he mean by this? Well, just to stick it into your minds, I'll give you the graphic example, the famous one. When he was living in that house in Kirkcaldy, he used to wander around and talk to lots of people, and he used to visit a factory where they made pins. Have any of you heard of the parable of the pin makers? Yes? One or two. Well, basically what he watched was how they made pins, and he did various tests which he showed that if one of you was trying to make a pin and you just made the whole pin, you hit the head and then you hit the lower part of it and then you sharpened it and then you put it in a box and so on, you could perhaps make 100 pins in an hour. If on the other hand there were 3 of you sitting along there and the first one tapped away making the head, pass it to the next one, as in a sort of Charlie Chaplin Modern Times film, along a conveyor belt, so to speak, to the next one who tapped at the middle part of the pin, pass it on to the third person who tapped the sharp end of the pin. There were 3 of you working for an hour. Now, you should make 300 pins. In fact, you made 1,000 pins. There was something magical happening by dividing tasks up into little bits. And he explained this in 3 ways. Firstly, you got increasing skill. If you concentrated on just making the head of the pin, you became a really expert head of a pin maker. That was one way in which you're beginning to get economic efficiency. Second, so dexterity. The second is that there is time wasted in many tasks in moving from one part of the action. If it's a more complex task than pin making, if you're, say, in agriculture, the time it takes you to move, say, from the ploughing to the hoeing in a field is a waste of time. If you've got 2 separate people who come on, the first lot do the ploughing, the second lot do the hoeing or whatever of the weeding, it's more efficient. And the third reason why the division of labour accelerates economic growth is that it makes you think about how these things are done. You apply to mechanical and technological and social tasks analysis, and you say, look, I'm knocking away at the top of this pin all the time. I wonder whether if I put another bit of wood under there, because I'm going to spend the next 6 years doing this, if I could just make that a little bit better, I'll put a bit of wood under there, tap, tap, tap. So basically the development of machinery and micro-inventions occur from this division. I'll give you another of his famous anecdotes, which isn't true and it isn't how things work, but it'll explain. He describes how a boy was set. There was a kind of steam engine going. A little boy, every time the one bit of the machinery came down here, he had to pull a bit of string there. So a bit of machinery come down, he pull a bit of string, in the end, he thought, well, why don't I tie this bit of string to that bit of machinery and let that bit of machinery pull the bit of string? So he joined them up, and there was a great micro-invention in that kind of steam engine. Well, most little boys wouldn't do that because they'd know they'd be out of a job if they did such a thing. But that was the story he told. So the development of machinery and technology flows out of the division of labour to a certain extent. And it's this growing efficiency of technology and craftsmanship which is behind much economic growth. Right, I'll just give you your accustomed break for a moment, and myself, and then we'll move on to his other theories. Are there any questions that anyone would like to ask? They didn't get a name or some concept?
How do you define wealth as money? As money that people have and can dispose of, or is it something?
How does that's a very interesting question, to which I'll try and give you a very brief. Does he define wealth as money? No, he doesn't. He defines wealth as well-being. I mean, the Adam Smith Institute, which, as you know, is a right-wing institute trying to promote the capitalist competitive market systems, and all the people who preach Adam Smith usually don't understand a word of what he's saying. He basically used wealth. If you want to understand what he used wealth in, there was a wonderful word, I think, invented by Ruskin called ilth. I-double-L-T-H. Ilth is the opposite of wealth. Ilth means war, famine, poverty, social stratification, the persecution of minorities. Everything that detracts from life is ilth. And what he meant by wealth was everything that contributes to life. Beautiful things, beautiful gardens, poetry, music, satisfaction, happiness, equality, all those things are wealth. So it's a much wider. It's been taken up by modern economists who now no longer use straight checks like GDP and so on. They bring in education, culture and happiness and freedom and all these sorts of things. But that's what he means by wealth. Okie doke. So if we can move now on to some of his other theories. His next theory is the effects of commerce on civility. You may not agree with this, but his general view was that whether you liked bartering and trading and the making of wealth or not, it was quite clear that countries that pursued these things became civil, that is, that they became well-mannered. He took as his example the Dutch. He said the Dutch, who were great traders at his time and so on, they're a very clean nation, good timekeeping, nice cities, good art. They're nice people. I mean, they may be boring. Sorry if there are any Dutch here with you. They may be boring and they may be bourgeois and all the rest of it, but you can trust a Dutchman, basically. And his argument was that being involved in commerce led to trustworthiness, good timekeeping, all the bourgeois virtues of shopkeepers, which you may scorn, but as his contemporary Samuel Johnson and then later Keynes put it, human beings, and this is Johnson roughly, human beings are never so innocently engaged as in making money. In other words, as I think I said last time, it's better than killing each other. You may be exploiting a bit, but it's a fairly innocent activity. So civility, the arts, crafts, decent living, come out of affluence, and you'll see how this fits into his argument. Because it goes against a very strong tendency in human beings. He wasn't under no illusion that half of our nature, all we want to do is go and destroy other people, or at least not destroy them, subordinate them, predate on them, as Ernest Gellner, that's a famous favourite word of Gellner, G-E-L-L-N-E-R, predation. That is abstracting things from other people. We are predating Homo predatoris. Human beings, like other species, predate on each other and on other species all the time. And that is a very strong tendency in our nature. Even if you can eliminate internal predation through the social structure, you get external predation attacking other people, which we see looming around us at the moment. Among, he says, neighbouring nations in a barbarous state, there are perpetual wars, one continually invading and plundering the others. And he points out that if that is the situation which you find in most of the history he read, that you cannot get economic development in such a situation. That's why peace is so important. When people find themselves every moment in danger of being robbed of all they possess, they have no motive to be industrious. Thus, large tracts of country are often laid waste and all the effects carried away. Germany was in this condition about the fall of the Roman Empire. Nothing can be such an obstacle to the progress of opulence as predation, violence towards other people. And it's a very strong tendency, which commerce and wealth, but there's a catch-22, as you see. That means there's a circular difficulty about this. How do you get out of that constant predation? Another theory he has is that some reasons for the stationary state of China. Now that may sound incredibly Orientalist and so on, but you'll have to read his fuller account to see what he meant. What he basically came to the conclusion in the middle of the 18th century was that you could divide the world into three main areas. There was one area that was really racing ahead in economic development, and that was North America. It was a new land. They were conspicuously making a new civilization and becoming very wealthy there. The next most notable case was England, which was rapidly becoming the richest place on earth. It was a very small place, but it was moving towards opulence quite dramatically. But in other parts of Europe, like even in Holland, and certainly in France, and which he visited, and in Italy and Spain and Portugal, things had reached a high level. This is a term taken from Mark Elvin's book on the pattern of the Chinese past, a high level equilibrium. They had gone like that. There had been rapid development, economic development in all these civilizations, but it reached an equilibrium. And indeed in Italy, Spain and Portugal and the southern Mediterranean, it was beginning to decline, likewise possibly in France. Holland was stationary. And he argued that the great civilizations, the greatest on earth, i.e. China, was like this. It was in equilibrium. Now why was this? Because China was very reasonably sort of governed. It was very peaceful. The taxation system wasn't horrendous, and the judicial system wasn't too awful. So it seemed to have the conditions for continued economic growth. And yet, as he says, if you look at the accounts of Marco Polo in the 13th century and the accounts of Du Halde in the 18th century, it seems to have, for about 500 years, been very affluent, the richest in the world, but stationary civilization in terms of economic growth. He explained this by two things. One is its inward-looking nature. Basically, in the 15th century, China decided not to push outwards, not to engage in overseas trading and so on. Having been a great trading nation, it turned in on itself, it built a wall, and it maintained itself. And he said this inhibits economic growth. It's through the exchange of commodities and what you learn about other civilizations that you'll get economic dynamism. The second reason why China was static was because of basically its agricultural system. Firstly, it made too much of its agricultural system. That is, agriculture was the center of the whole of Chinese thought, and manufacturing and industry and all the other things that you need were downplayed. And secondly, and this is very similar to Montesquieu, there was the problem of rice. Rice basically leads you to very dense populations, as Montesquieu had noticed and he emphasized. And so you get a very hard-working, intensive, what Geertz, G-W-E-R-T-Z, calls agricultural involution, which is anticipated by these people. You get agricultural involution, more and more labor thrown into rice production, and this encourages it's not just that everyone's working very hard in dense populations, but it encourages a certain kind of social stratification, a class of landlords who live off the profits of the rice cultivation, and the surpluses are creamed off by them and the mandarins and so on, and they're involved in politics and conspicuous display of various kinds, but not in manufacturing and craft activities that you need for the development of commercial civilizations. And he thought that this isn't confined to rice, that the same thing would happen with potatoes. In a way, he anticipated what happened in Ireland with the great potato famine, a crop that everyone can grow very easily, and you get a very rapid rise of population, and then potato blight and the last great famine in European history up till now. So that was some of the reasons for China's stationary state. The effects of towns and how towns emerged. Very briefly, because he lived in Glasgow, he had a very ambivalent view towards towns. He didn't like the mentality and the morality, the kind of shopkeeper morality which he saw around him on the whole. On the other hand, he thought that towns were the hub of economic development to a large extent. And he faced a problem which some of you may not have even considered, which is how did towns emerge and develop? Normally, the situation in most civilizations is that as soon as someone gets some wealth, starts building a town, all the people, the rich lords and feudal forces around them, come and destroy them. This is the famous theory of Ibn Khaldun in relation to North Africa in his Muqaddimah. Basically, you get the townsmen becoming wealthy, and then the wolves circling around and destroying the cities within a generation or two, and then it starts all over again. Why didn't this happen in Western Europe, and how do you get the development of these prosperous towns like Glasgow and London and Paris? He has a very interesting theory, which in a nutshell is that there are three forces in agrarian civilizations. There's the lords, there's the townsmen, and there are the who are the other? Can't be the clergy. Can anyone think? Well, I'm... just one of those. It's known as a senior moment in America, where you can't remember what the third... oh yes, the king. Okay? So the king, these three are in opposition. The king fears his lords and the feudal forces. So what he does is he allies himself with the towns. The towns fear these people too. So the development of free towns with their own rights of taxation, magistrates and so on in the West developed because the lords sided and gave them liberties and strength and so on. And so gradually, by the time they'd become really rich and really taxable by the king, it was too late. They were free. And so it was out of these tension, the free burghs established themselves. And such a development was amazing. It hardly ever happened anywhere in the world. It's something that Max Weber, in his great book on the city, picks up. The free cities of northwestern Europe are a peculiar phenomenon which you find in no other civilizations. And it, he argues anyway, and it comes out of a tension between these contending powers. The odd middle class social structure of England, because what he was amazed at was how was England becoming so wealthy. And his argument really was that it was because it had a strange social structure where you had a large number of middling people who were townsmen, craftsmen, yeomen, lived well, provided a consumer market, and so on. And this hardly ever happens. Nearly all civilizations polarize into very poor people at the top, rich people at the top and very poor people at the bottom. And he argued that this largely, again, emerges, to put in a nutshell, out of the island nature of England. That in most landed agrarian civilizations, the lords can threaten and destroy any kind of opposition and destroy the middle class by threatening to let foreign warlords in or whatever. In the case of England, the middling groups, the townsmen, the craftsmen, the yeomen, established their separateness and wealth. The importance of easy taxes I've mentioned. What he meant by that was predictable and fair taxation. It could be quite large. England was the most heavily taxed country in Europe in the 18th century. but everyone knew when it occurred, and they were very wealthy, so they didn't mind paying these largish taxes. The breaking of the Scottish clan system, which he'd witnessed, comes out of his famous theory that people desiring show and baubles, the Scottish landlords sold off their peasants when they discovered that it was better to keep sheep on their land than peasants. So the whole clanship system was destroyed by individual naked greed. Another of his famous theories, the night watchman state. Basically, he says the state is absolutely essential for defense, for setting up large things like railway systems or transport systems, and for providing the judicial system. But then it shouldn't interfere. It should let people pursue their own self-interest. I've mentioned how production conquered predation through commerce to a certain extent, the dangers of war, and just at the end here, basically he was a pessimist. He thought he couldn't see how human beings were going to escape from an agrarian civilization. Although he was down the corridor from James Watt, he never realized the implications of the steam engine, what it would do to the world. And so he basically thought we are trapped at a high level equilibrium. China's hit it. Holland is hitting it because of the fall in the rate of profit, the law of diminishing marginal returns, which means as you work harder, you get less and less for each extra input you put in. The law of population, which he anticipated Malthus's idea that any growth in prosperity and technology will be fed into growing population. And basically, the sun brings a certain amount of energy down onto the earth, and if you turn it through agriculture into things for human beings, we're never going to, on this planet, have more than about 500 million, which is about what he had at his time. Plus, the division of labour leads to misery. Who wants to make the heads of pins for the rest of their lives? So he wasn't optimistic about a possibility of escape, but he did lay the ground plan for the development of the affluence of everyone up to a reasonable level at 500 million. Now we're 6.5 billion, and all his pessimistic views have partly been borne out and partly undermined by things I'll talk about in later lectures. Thank you very much indeed.